LaGina, did you have PowerPoints that you wanted to show, or are you just going to talk? Okay.
Yeah. I made it. I know y'all were like, where is she? Is she coming?
Hi, Valeria. How are you?
Hi.
We're waiting for Perry, and then we'll get started.
Professor Sinclair-Chapman, the party don't start till you get there.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hey.
I enjoyed your comments in the last session as well.
Very much.
I must say, this is a powerhouse panel. I'm looking at all that I know personally and amazing work. I don't normally get that diagram like that, you know.
First of all, I ain't had my earbuds in and they are attached to my computer. So, hey, I was talking. I don't know if you saw me. I was probably pantomiming, but good morning or afternoon or whatever time of day. Hey.
Hi, how are you?
I'm here. I'm good. I'm excited about this.
Me too. I'm excited y'all
Yeah.
are here.
Oh, yeah. So,
Give Perry one more minute, then we'll get started.
I'll get my good side. I have a style.
I saw that. I was worried. It looked a little swollen.
I know. Oh, I have a style. I haven't had a style in 20 years. But
Oh wow.
yeah, so stress.
I was about to ask if it was that. Because that'll do it.
No, yeah, I'm at my parents' house. My dad had emergency surgery last
no.
Thursday. So
I hope things are okay.
yeah, he's doing well. He's back to his regular. I mean, he's not, but he thinks he is. So I'm trying to hold him back for as long as I can. So, but he's doing well.
Sending you well wishes.
Yeah, I will.
All right, I think we've got our main panelists. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 53rd anniversary of the National Conference of, annual meeting of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. Today's session is an author meets critic. Today we'll be discussing the advantage of disadvantage, costly protest and political representation for marginalized groups by Dr. LaGina Gause. Today is an author meets critic, but I want to recast this as a bit of a celebration. This is LaGina's first book, and that is something to absolutely celebrate. LaGina and I were classmates at Howard, and so it's amazing to be witness to us being on this side of things. And so I'm incredibly privileged to be here. And so today we'll be discussing her work in this new book with an august panel of scholars, all of whom have written on Black political protest. So we have LaGina Gause, who's the author of the book Advantage of Disadvantage. She is an assistant professor of political science at UC San Diego. She will be in community and conversation with Dr. Periloux, Peay, who is an assistant professor of political science at Georgia State University. And we're also joined by Dr. Ray Block, who's the Brown McCourtney Career Development Professor in the McCourtney Institute and Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at the Penn State University. And we have Dr. Valeria Sinclair-Chapman, who's a professor of political science at Purdue University. And just to give some background about our critics and why they've been asked to join us today, Dr. Peay is the author of No Justice, Black Protest, No Peace, The Racial Nature of Threat, Evaluation of Nonviolent Black Lives Matter Protests, which was published in Social Science Quarterly. Dr. Block is the co-author of The Politics of Protest, reading of the Black Lives Matter movement. And Dr. Sinclair-Chapman is the co-author of Countervailing Forces in African American Civic Activism, 1973 to 1994. And so I want to welcome all of our panelists today and thank you for joining us in conversation to discuss Dr. Gause's book, The Advantage of Disadvantage. I want to invite Dr. Gause to introduce the topic, but before I do that, I just want to read the back sheet of the book, which is now available on Amazon, from Dr. Daniel Gillian, a university professor at Penn. Guarded with the theoretical savviness of a budding eminent scholar and the empirical sophistication of a formal modeling, Dr. Gause introduces us to the powerful ways that protest adds to American democracy. This book will be widely read, immensely studied, and rigorously followed as a bold new way to understand protests in America. So LaGina, let's get started with you. If you could tell us a little bit about the book, how and why did you arrive at this particular question, and give us a summation?
Thank you, Dr. Crawford. Your introduction reminded me that you're in part one of the reasons I'm here. I still remember being a student at Howard and you telling me about this Ralph Bunche Summer Institute and telling me I should participate. And I looked at you and I was just like, why would I ever want to spend my summer doing research, reading and writing, all these things that, you know, summer is not supposed to be about. But I listened to you because you always seem to have all the right advice, and really learned like what academia could be about and how I could really like make learn about things that were really important to me, right? And that was a lot of the reason why I wrote this book, because I was very interested in understanding one, challenging this narrative of like when people who are marginalized get things, it's because of, you know, these well-meaning white middle-class people who decide to change their mind and represent them. And I wanted to challenge that narrative because that's not really my experience, not my view of the world, not really how I saw things happening. It was really about, you know, a lot of people having agency and standing up for themselves. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this book was to really demonstrate in the tradition of many NCOPE scholars, including many here today, that marginalized people, people of color, Black people are actually out there on a daily basis trying to demand representation and get things for themselves in ways that aren't really acknowledged in the ways that they should be. And so this book, The Advantage of Disadvantage, the central argument is that when people protest, legislators listen, and that they're especially likely to listen to the people who are engaging in costly protests. And so protest is costly when you show up to a protest and wanting to ask for basic things, and you're met with police and riot gear, with tear gas and rubber bullets, right? And that's more likely to happen for Black protesters and people of color and people challenging these mainstream narratives than it is for other groups, right? And it's costly for people who, when they show up to ask for things, they're told that what they're wanting isn't really something that we should care about, right? Like asking for basic, the water to drink, right, is something that is misrepresented often in the media and in the way that public talks about it. So I'm reminded of some work I'm doing with Mara Osfeld and Stephen Moore on how the race of protesters really changes the way that media uses words that provoke people's anger and fear and desire to kind of want to challenge or to seek more information about like whether the issues that people are protesting are legit or not, right? Whereas when you see white people protesting, you know, showing up to a Capitol building, whether in state capitals or national capitals, armed, right? There's this like, oh, they're just being patriotic, right? It's just about their desire to ask for things. And, you know, we don't really think they're being like illegitimate, but people of color, Black people, when they show up to protest, even if they're playing kind of the respectability politics game and dressed to the nines in their church gear, they're perceived as being violent and criminal and all of these things to justify police actions and also delegitimize the things that they're asking about, right? We shouldn't care because they're criminals, right? If they weren't criminals, if they asked in a better way, then maybe we should care, right? But what I find in arguing this book is that even though protest is really costly for certain segments of the population, the fact that people are willing to show up and risk arrest, risk police violence, risk public ridicule, means that they actually really care and about an issue enough where they're gonna not just show up to protest, but also engage in other electoral politics in ways that can really challenge a legislator's ability to stay in their job. And because legislators want to stay in their job, they have to respond, right? People who protest are also more likely to vote, either because they were already politically engaged or because a particular issue has pushed them to care more about a particular topic or electoral politics, right? They're also more likely to, their protest also demonstrates their ability to mobilize people around an election in ways that really challenges them, right? So in the book, I talk about losing to Port Bush because people felt like he was no longer representing the community. And then she was this activist showing up and saying, now I will represent you. So putting forward candidates who can challenge officials, but also deciding to disengage for an election or vote for other candidates is something that protest demonstrates is a potential eventuality, right? So when legislators are responding, when they're listening to this costly protest, they're doing it through, I look particularly at voting behavior on roll call votes that have already been established, because I wanted to understand kind of these marginal, moderate legislators and whether they're listening to protests, right? We have a lot of research and history and literature on kind of legislators who champion the values and the issues that are being protested. I wanted to understand what pushes those who are more reluctant to pay attention. And here I found that a lot of it's about just their desire to be reelected. And then one more thing about, or I guess two more. Another thing about the reason for writing this book is wanting to highlight the hypocrisy of kind of how we think of protests as a legitimate form of representation, right? Or of participation, right? Some groups, when they protest, it's like I mentioned before, like patriotic, but others, it's just seen as like this wayward, non-traditional thing that should be condemned and not represented. And so I start by trying to talk about how like the history of protests in the United States and how legally the right to protest is something that we should value. And then finally, just talking about how a lot of times when we talk about inequalities in representation, the same groups continue to win over and over again. Middle and upper class people, white people. And I wanted to demonstrate how moments when people of color and low resource people are able to gain representation. So that's kind of an overview of the book and some of my motivations for writing it. And I'm very excited and interested to hear comments from the critics, who I actually consider, friends and not critics, but also, very interested in some of the insights that I might not even be aware of from the work as well.
Awesome, thank you so much. I want to invite our family into the community of conversation. Critics, we need to get rid of that word. We're going to start with Dr. Peay and move our way up to Dr. Block and Dr. Sinclair-Chapman. I also want to invite the audience to post questions in the chat box. We're going to try to do a little bit of a round robin. I want to give Dr. Gause an opportunity to respond to some of the comments at the end. So Dr. Peay, please.
Oh, wow. Okay, cool. First of all, thank you all for even inviting me, for allowing me to sit in this space virtually. Hopefully next year we'll be together with people that I duly respect, and I appreciate y'all's presence here as well. I'm not going to go long. I don't know how the format is, but I'm not going to go long. One thing that I do have to say up front is that as somebody that studies Congress, I am a natural skeptic of floor votes as a measure of politics in general. This is not I'm not a skeptic of your work or anything like that, but I do think that a lot of people use floor votes incorrectly, and they try to draw out inferences from either floor votes or proxies of floor votes without doing the work. And the first thing that I want to say is, like, I am sold because you did the work. And I appreciate the care and the nuance that you took with a lot of the measures that you used, and how you went about actually not just centering floor votes as a measure, because that's not just what you did. There was a rich analysis around it that I really, really appreciated. And the build up to the information was done with care, and I really do appreciate that part, first and foremost. So like I say, I came in a skeptic of floor votes, and I'm convinced that I'm not just convinced that folks can do good research, but I appreciate you for showing people the model of how to do good research around a measure that is so often misused and overused and saturated. So I do appreciate that first and foremost. Now, I also want to talk about, like, how I came into my process, right? So I was reading, when I first got the manuscript, I was reading through the introduction, and all these questions kept coming into my head, like popping up. The first thing that I ask is, like, first floor vote stuff. I was like, man, okay, cool. I've already talked about how those were remedies, those concerns were remedied about floor votes. But also, like, I asked, like, almost off the bat, I saw the connection to Mayhew, and I was like, okay, cool. It's grounded in Mayhew. That's a sound foundation to build on. And then in my mind, I'm like, okay, if it's about re-election, does responsiveness change? If as one is tenured, or like the more security you have. And then in which chapter it was, I think it was 5 or 6. You answered that question. I was like, okay, cool. And you have a whole thing about electoral accountability and tenure in office, and that was answered. I also asked, a lot of different questions about, like, the type of attention that lawmakers are paying a lot to protests. Is it them paying attention, or is it their staffers paying attention? And every time I had a question, you were great at just answering it in the right time, right? Because I'm a person that will jump the gun on a lot of things and that will sway how I read things. But like as soon as I ask the question, the answer, like as I'm reading, the answer would just flow out. And that was, I love the setup of how you went about developing the book. A few things the interview, I am jealous of your interview chapters because that was absolutely engaging and rich, and I know it was hard to do. So I appreciate the labor and effort that you put into the chapter of not just getting the interviews, but organizing them in a thoughtful manner to point out your different conditions and how each set of interviews, not just like reinforce the conditions that you expected to happen, but it also like solidified that, yeah, I know what I'm talking about in this instance, and this is what they're doing, and this is how they perceive protests, and all of these conditions are met. So just the labor of love that was put into acquiring those interviews, and I know that you probably have 2 to 3 books worth of data just in those interviews alone. So I'm anxious to see what else comes out of that. I appreciate that. So I'm going to go to a few questions that, like, as I'm reading, and I still need time to sit with the book because, like, I've had it for a couple of months and I've read through it, but I want to sit with it and bake on each chapter. One thing that that came to mind, one of my initial questions is if it's about re-election, does responsiveness change given
I think you may have frozen us. Give him a second to buffer. All right, I think we may have lost him. Dr. Block, can you jump in the intro?
Yeah, and I'm happy to jump back out once PA gets back onto the line. So I'm gonna go in a different direction.
He's here. He's here.
Ooh.
Sorry, Ray.
that would help? That would absolutely help. What was the last thing y'all got?
Does response, you were asking a question about responsiveness.
Oh, yes. So one thing that off the bat that I was wondering if it's about re-election, does responsiveness change given the proximity to an election? And we know that one of the reasons why the Democrats were in the Capitol Hill wearing kente cloths and kneeling was because it was in the middle of an election year. It was 3 or 4 months out from the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor wave of Black Lives Matter happened in the midst of that election year. So I'd like to see a more in-depth conversation of like, not just that they're paying attention, but when they're more likely to pay attention than not. And I don't know if I got that in the first reading. Also, again, I told you I need to sit with it. So that if it's in there, I forget that I even said that, and that's great, because I just missed it on the first reading. Another thing that another question that I had was, how does it play out when a group has a range of demands, and which ones are they more like, within that range of demands, which ones are they responsive to? And I think it's hard to get at that with floor votes because, like, as we know with like Black Lives Matter and other groups, they have that are a range of demands that are on an ideological spectrum. So are moderates paying more attention to the moderate demands? Are liberals paying more attention to the more progressive demands? Things like that. Another comment, I know we focused a lot on the floor votes, right? But we know that floor votes are negotiated, they're partisan, and you get at the partisan mode of it. But I'm wondering, as a policy process guy, what does responsiveness look like at other phases of the legislative process, and in terms of committee hearings and things like that? So it's not necessarily at what like Gillian and others get at, but the costly protests and the considerations of cost and how that impacts earlier processes and stages of the legislative process. And I think that's it right now. I want to leave a little bit to the like back and forth, but I those were the big questions that I was left with as I walked away. And again, like I said, I need to sit with it and let it bake. And if I get those answers on the next read, then I'm even more happy, because I liked everything about this book. And I wish I can't say it any more like emphatic, but amazing job. I look forward to every other book that you write now, and you have not just a fan, but like somebody that will be writing with you in this process. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Peay. Unshameless plug. I've dropped the link for the book in the chat box. So please, at some time, take a moment to go purchase the book. At this moment, I want to invite Dr. Block.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to follow up with the idea that this is a celebration, right? So like the critic part doesn't really quite help out for what I'm about to do. And what I'm about to do is talk about how you awesome, right? And so I got a background in this. So before I got to Penn State, man, I'd spent most of my career as a professor at a teaching-oriented university. And I'm thinking about how this is good. This is good material for classes. And I'm saying classes, not class, right? You got something for everybody in this book. I see you, right? So I'm not a Congress scholar. I can't even speak to that, but I'm a political participation scholar who happens to study things that are unconventional types of political action, right? I love the fact that in the beginning of the book, you talk about the Michigan folks. You know what I mean? I'm an O State guy, but my O State heritage puts me in contact with a lot of these Michigan folk, right? So Rick Hall and Ken Coleman and Vince Hutchins show up when you're talking about how you came to the project, right? I'm thinking about Nancy Burns too, because of that metaphor of political action being a voice, you know, and for the intricacies of the formal model and the theory that you build, it's really about that being a form of political communication, right? It's body language. And for whatever reason, it's a very strong signal when it comes from the people that are going to be hurt the most by sending that signal, you know, and I appreciate that from a voice kind of political metaphor type of way. I also looked at the series you're in, and you don't just accidentally luck up into a series like Cambridge on contentious politics with Doug McAdam being the head of, you know what I mean? And so like you have this literature that I know now because I work with a bunch of comparativists in contentious politics, mixing that up with some of the stuff that I read in Black politics on social movements, mixing that up with some of the high-end method stuff you get from legislative studies, and mixing that up with some of the computer science stuff people talk about when they study social networks. I see you, right? And one of the things I appreciate too is because of the broad scope of what you're working on, you had to do it the way you did. So you start with this historical way of thinking about what this type of collective action is and how legitimate it is as a form of political voice. And then you go through meticulously and you show that to everybody. But then at the end of the book, you make sure everybody knows you talk about some Black folks, right? And the like democratic implications of what you're doing, like you thread it through. But I see, right? The way you had to set this up is that you had to keep the audience big so that folks that aren't inclined to like reading stuff about Black folks still stay along. And then at the end, you hit them over the head with it. You just let them know that politics in this country or abroad fundamentally doesn't make sense if you don't understand race relations. And that's a hook that is evident throughout the book, but it's threaded in such a way that I could teach this class to a race politics bunch of students. I could teach it to some legislative studies students. I could take this piece and use it in a comparative politics course on contentious politics, where the United States recently would be the case that people are studying for it, right? And I could show them the appendix and let them know that there's a strategic actor way of thinking about how this signal to voice ratio actually plays out. And you have that legislator constituent relationship built in, right? Which makes this a representation piece, even though representation might not necessarily be the primary audience for the work that you're talking about. I see you, right? So I'm saying thank you for doing that, because not only am I thinking about this in terms of how I would teach it, I'm also thinking about this in terms of how this book teaches people who do this kind of work how to write books that way, right? How to write books that span multiple literatures and multiple scholarly traditions, and how those books can be so meaningful if they're done the right way, And if they're grounded in Black studies the way that your book is done, I'm grounded in it, I see you. That's it. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Block. Dr. Sinclair-Chapman, I invite you in.
Thank you. It's hard to follow these the fellas this morning. So, but let me do my best effort. I have a few notes, and then I have a couple questions, and I basically feel like Ray just did a call and response to himself. I see you. So there was a refrain. So and I think that Peay covered a lot of ground as well. So I'll see what I can add. And so let me just turn to my notes briefly to say that in this important text that what Dr. Gause is able to do, I think very well and convincingly, as has already been demonstrated in the other commentary, is to show how the careful study of Black politics and the experiences of Black and Brown people can provide important and perhaps unexpected insights to our understanding of American politics more broadly, and the way that we might understand tenets in basic tenets in American politics. So this gives us some insights into what Mayhew might be talking about, or Mansur Olson or others, as it regards to collective action or strategic behavior within legislatures. One of the things that I think that Dr. Gause does in this very well written and articulated book is she begins with some basic kinds of ideas about what American, the founders, the framers of the American Constitution imagined as representation, who might be represented, and how that might come about. And so she begins with the Federalist Papers and the idea that Madison says even beyond the Federalist Papers, beyond Federalist number 10, but elsewhere, that the legislature ought to be a portrait in miniature of the people that the nation represents. And of course, when the framers were thinking about that, it did not include Black or Brown people, it did not include women. So we were only talking about white propertied white men. Those were the people who merited representation. It was their protest that might matter. Anyone else certainly was limited both in terms of their access to the vote and their ability over decades and centuries to gain the franchise. I think that Dr. Gause does, I think, an inventive and seamless approach to really bringing people in with the intuition that comes from doing formal modeling in Black politics, which is also a welcome intervention, particularly in terms of us thinking about and being careful about the consideration of what collective action is, how protest is a kind of collective action. In fact, she uses the terms interchangeably, which is nice. That collective action doesn't only involve firms or organizations and others, but that it can also involve both organized and grassroots protests. And she frames this protests in light of the cost, both to those who are protesting, as well as to the perceived cost by those who are looking to maintain the offices and the power that they already have. The way that Dr. Gause introduces this to us, or the way that she's talked about it even today, is that this protest, some are rewarded for protest and others are not. Some protesters are recognized and welcome while others are not. I would say that there are some protests and some protesters who are viewed immediately with suspicion and are viewed to be un-American. In fact, their protest itself is viewed to be un-American. And so I think that we certainly see the vagaries of white supremacy and racism and discrimination in who is heard with their protests. But while we might begin there in the ways that Black voices and Brown voices and the voices of the poor and young people are disregarded, Gause's work actually tells us and demonstrates to us with the intuition of a formal model that there might be some other things that we need to pay attention to. And one of those is that high resource groups, when they protest, send murky signals. Oftentimes they have the resources to protest, and so it's not costly to them. Will this issue endure for them? How important is it to them? Is it highly salient to them? Their signals then are a bit ambiguous, whereas low resource groups, when they protest, the issue must be highly salient because low resource groups would not protest a low salient issue because they don't have the resources to do so. I really enjoyed the way that Dr. Gause has introduced us to a whole range of resources beyond time and money to include even attention. So who pays attention? When does the public pay attention to protesters? What other, she lays out a whole set of other kinds of resources that are related to protests. I'm trying to scroll through and see what they are, so I've lost them, but a whole set of others, and maybe Dr. Gause, you can talk about that a little bit more, but not everyone benefits from protest equally. Not everyone has the same set of resources to protest in the first place, and that goes beyond both time and money. And so what are those additional kinds of resources that are necessary? But what this does then, when we recognize that not everyone has the resources to protest, and that when people with low resources do protest, it sends a much more credible signal to legislators. And when that signal is sent, they recognize that failure to respond at the protest can mean cost at the polls, right? And so that is, I think, just a marvelous insight that this careful analysis brings to the table. And I think it can be accessible to many audiences, including perhaps legislators. But this insight is that when legislators take into account their own risk and the risk of their electoral fortunes, that when people with few resources protest on a highly salient issue, that their protest is credible and can be perhaps mobilized into voting and to cost for them for elected officials when it comes to their own electoral calculations. So protests change the calculations, the strategic calculus of legislators in a variety of ways. All right, so one of the things that I wanted to say, I think much has already been mentioned. I had just a few kinds of things that resonated with me. Some of them you could not possibly know, and that is that my very first internship was for Maxine Waters. I worked for the Congresswoman as a legislative intern in 1992. So right around, right after what Maxine Waters called the rebellion, right? Because she never called it a riot, and the rest of the world called it a riot. And so that this book begins with a kind of thoughtful story about the loan guarantee legislation that Maxine Waters pressed for, I thought was really important. There's such good storytelling in this book. Oh, here's my list of resources: positive and negative stereotypes, public sentiment and value, access to politicians, so more than time and money. I felt like those things were really important connections to make that we don't see in other literature, or as much as I would like, particularly in political science. Another kind of observation I made as I was reading it is that when a legislator sees that the risk is great, they take action. but they don't always know. So you actually have a signaling model where there's incomplete information, and where these legislators are making calculations that sometimes they're unsure of. And I think that in Georgia, they are now regretting that they did not take Stacey Abrams seriously enough the first time, and it cost them the Senate. So they won the governorship by hook and by crook, but they lost the Senate. I don't know how long it'll stay lost. Clearly, they've changed laws to prevent that from happening again. And this was perhaps not a protest, but it was certainly a movement that was in response to the lack of responsiveness from institutions to the desire of Black and Brown and young people for better and clearer and more vocal representation. Let's see. One of the conclusions that Dr. Gause makes is that protests will garner attention over non-protests, but not all groups have to protest in order to get attention. Some groups cannot vote, and so their protests may still matter. These are other avenues that we might consider even in future research. In thinking about this, I thought about January 6th, or even protests around masks, right? These are people who we think that their signals might be murky, but they were certainly taken up by legislators. And I wondered what Dr. Gause or others in the room might think about that. Is it a simple kind of articulation of kind of race or youthfulness or value, or is there something else going on with perhaps the idea that many didn't anticipate the kind of outcomes of January 6th, the kind of violence associated with it, but that they were also protected for a time? If in other circumstances, we would have seen 3,000 people locked up. They would have closed the doors and shot people that came out, right? I mean, we can certainly imagine that because it's happened before in history, but not to this particular kind of group. So were they sending an ambiguous symbol, a signal, or what was happening? And I thought as well then of the youth, the March for Our Lives, or of the Dreamers in the early 2000s and the 2010s that marched, the young Latinos that march for undocumented populations, and how that might fit into this work. Dr. Gause makes connections between legislators and protests, as does Gillian and others in this room as well. And I wondered, how do legislators like Maxine Waters or Cori Bush, who you write about, how do they use protests to their benefit? It made me think of one of my favorite legislators, the legislator who my father has called historically the representative of the Black man's representative, Adam Clayton Powell, and his relationship to protest, to the protest movements of the 1960s, which he used as a threat in order to move forward with legislation that would forbid segregation in places that use federal dollars, right? And so, and in other ways. So he used the threat of protest to help get some of his legislative agenda passed. And Mike Menta has a new piece that's coming out, well, it might be out now, about lobbying and interest groups and political representation. And so does, there's another woman who's done some work on the NAACP and representation. And so that insider-outsider kind of relationship, I wondered if we could think a little bit more about that. And I'll wrap up in just a second. I wondered about, because somebody like Clay was perhaps not as responsive, or other Black legislators or Latino legislators, you talked about Mexican American legislators who were more supportive of white protesters than of Latino protesters. And I wondered if there's a risk of in-group support for protest. Kind of thinking of Kathy Cohen's idea of advanced marginalization and respectability politics. Are legislators there to kind of keep people in line, and is part of that demonstrating that they're able to keep people in line? I'm kind of thinking of the Denzel's Malcolm X movie when he raises his hand and everybody turns around and goes home. Is that the kind of presentation that these legislators of color are trying to demonstrate? And finally, I wondered about Clay and Cori Bush and the implications for influence and representation. Again, related to insider and outsider politics, electoral implications and descriptive representation. Clay was an insider. He had moved to the top of the food chain within the legislature. Cori Bush is, she's new, right? Much less influence internal to the institution, but certainly a much broader following outside of it. Are there costs associated with the win that Cori Bush had over the loss that Congressman Clay had? So thank you, and I appreciate it. I enjoyed the book.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of the panelists for offering their comments. I want to invite LaGina and the rest of the panelists into a conversation. First, giving LaGina an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of those comments and questions. I'll try to answer some of them that I made note of. So first for Dr. Peay. Your first question was, is there something in there, or can I speak to the timing of elections with respect to responsiveness? So I kind of talk about this a little in the conclusion, but part of it was, so I use the congressional session, so these 2-year terms as the endpoint to give legislators a time to be responsive, partly for methodological reasons. Like once Congress changes, that changes lots of things about the types of bills that'll be put forth. But also partly because there's this belief that voters are very like, they don't have long time horizons and kind of how they think about things, right? So if they really want something, they want it now, they'll respond now. But if it like, they have time to figure out how to like live their lives without this one demand, maybe their issue salience decreases. But I also don't think that's how real life happens. I think even if an issue is less important, and sometimes at one time it can reemerge as a very salient thing. Summers tend to be times of more protests than other times of the year. Weather might have to do with it, more free time because of I guess like school and education, and you know, people travel more in the summer, whatever. But so it may not be like a linear thing, a more cyclical thing, but also there's just the case that just certain issues reemerge and sometimes, right? So it could be some leader who's showing up and saying, hey, you remember that thing you really cared about? Let's get at it again. And they do, and they pay more attention to it. So I think when the election happens is an important time because legislators may get more nervous, but in general, they tend to be nervous at any given time about how people are approving of them or not, and whether what they're doing today is going to affect kind of how people vote a year and a half later. So I think that it's a hard question to really get at, and maybe it just takes more research to get there to really understand. How does it play out when a group has a range of demands? I mean, so I started this by talking about how I wanted to like demonstrate agency and like inequality, and then how things might be more complicated than we think. But I also think I'm more of a realist or cynic in that like some of the representation that we're seeing is pretty symbolic and not very substantive. I mean, even if you think about like a parent with their kids, and their kids are like upset about a lot of things, and it's like, okay, if I give you this one thing, I know it's gonna like quiet you down and like be okay. Like a lot of this is about bargaining and a negotiation, right? And in no negotiation and bargaining agreement do you get everything you want. And so there's this kind of back and forth of how much do I need to give you in order for me to feel like I'm not giving up too much, and you to feel like you're getting enough for what you want. And so in this bundle of issues that like people care about, there tends to be this kind of, well, I can immediately act on this one thing, though it's not going to maybe provide a lot of like substantive or groundbreaking representation. Some things take longer, right? So there may be like this temporal thing, but there also just may be the ability of a legislator to like credit claim and say, hey, you asked for police accountability. Look, I gave you cameras. Why are you still asking me for things, right? Because the audience isn't only just the protesters, but also people who are paying attention. So again, I don't think there's a clear answer, but I do think a lot of it is about just kind of the strategic interaction where two parties are trying to get what they want out of like a negotiation. What does responsiveness look like at other stages of the process? I think this also relates to some comments I had for Dr. Chapman on thinking about legislators, insiders and outsiders, and using protests as well as in their response to protests, like whether they are participating or using protests to kind of demonstrate their commitment to an issue, or as a way to calm populations that they don't want to continue protesting. So I'm working on this new project that's looking at legislators who protest from a Black politics, race and ethnic politics perspective, but also trying to understand these conservatives who've been protesting a lot more recently and what that looks like, to understand both, because there are many audiences, right? There's their constituents, there's the public who doesn't really vote for them, and then there are the legislators in Congress. And are they doing this to demonstrate to the legislators in Congress, like, if you want to get this issue done, but you don't want to be the figurehead of it, like I'm willing to do that for you so that we can just get this bill passed? Or is it, or are they doing this at a cost where now other legislators don't think they're serious about their job because they're doing all of these other things? So the basic answer to both of those questions is, I think more research needs to be done there, and I don't know the answers. I just know that legislators also use protests as a tool in a lot of ways to get a lot of things done. Yes, political parties are also an audience as well, right? So yeah, the research on going public and the attempt to try to demonstrate that like your political party is the one committed to this particular issue, even if you can't pass legislation, at least we're out in public saying that we're trying to do it, and kind of the signaling game, or not the, I don't know, I guess it's somewhat of a signaling game, but the communication game of trying to appear responsive, even if there's no like tangible representation for that. And I guess a lot of that's going on now with Democrats and trying to pass lots of different types of legislation. Oh, the question of January 6th and mass protests and why are their issues being taken serious, right? So I think I have two answers to that. One is that a lot of those protests are about defending the status quo. And in some of those ways, like protest is like an additional way for people to get representation for things that they've been getting all along, right? Like this is a backlash to feeling like minorities are getting things. And so because of that, they're speaking out, demanding that minorities stop getting things and things go back to the things that the way they've been. But also, well, I guess I have three answers. Also, I'm working on another project, just thinking about like this moment of being in a global pandemic where people are stuck at home, lots of concerns, fears, anxieties, trying to figure out places to give outlet to some of their really their concerns. And these, like when protest is kind of like a follow the leader type thing, and leader is not really like big L leader, but it could just be like what's the topic of conversation right now, right? And so people are showing up to protest not necessarily because they like care about mask mandates, but because people are protesting about mask mandates and they want something to do, and they're frustrated about other things, so they're showing up about it. But on the other side, you have legislators who are like, I don't know how to fix this COVID thing, so I guess I'll listen to these people who don't want to wear masks, right? Like, I don't know that it's necessarily about like giving people what they want, and more just about like trying to give people something, because public officials, lawmakers don't really know how to deal with the pandemic in a very efficient way, because they're as shocked by it as the general public. On the January 6th, I don't know that it's a huge aberration, right? Like, yes, it is, in the fact that like a scale of a riot or a uprising that big hasn't happened at that scale in a long time, right? But they were precursors, right? Happening at state capitals, at local capitals. And even before then, right? Like the takeover of government properties because you feel like they're infringing on your land, right? Like those things have always happened, and they've always been considered to be like patriotic, and the people doing those have, I guess, been coddled is the word I want to use, right? It's not really a, and they didn't really get everything they wanted, right? Like the election wasn't overturned, right? They weren't, that was their big thing. Like they wanted the election overturned. They wanted this president to win, even if the public didn't vote for him. They also, but the reaction to that, I think, is just like related to these resources argument, right? Like the fact that there was no arrest, there was no violence, there was this like feeling of, well, they aren't really bad people, right? Even though they're doing really bad things, it's okay because like their intentions matter. And even though they're saying that their intentions are bad, like they don't really mean that, right? So I think that very much relates to kind of this understanding of costly protests. But they didn't really get like the main thing that they wanted, which was, you know, to take over the country, and they're still fighting that battle, like even now. I think I'll pause there. I guess get more comments and conversation from other panelists.
Thank you. I do want to invite the panelists to ask additional questions if they'd like. I'd like to start with one or two. Dr. Sinclair-Chapman had asked about, and you alluded to it a little bit, LeGina, how do legislators benefit from protest? And you started talking a little bit about how they use it, and I'd be curious if you could expand on that. And the other thing is kind of the dovetail of what you just discussed related to January 6th. I'm wondering if the last 2 pandemic years has really created a focusing event where we've seen these state level protests, largely white, and kind of looking at how protests, I think to the point you made, has been treated differently across space and time. And wondering how after January 6th, in view of protests at state capitals against mask mandates, how that may have changed the narrative about protests related to police brutality. If it's going to have an effect at all, we see an effort to change the narrative, certainly related to what people at the Capitol were really trying to achieve. But I'm curious how these dynamics may have changed the narrative, how Trump responded to protesters outside of the White House. If your work can speak to that, or if you have any general thoughts about that.
Yeah, on the how do legislators benefit from protests, I think Dr. Chapman talked about this a bit, and I bring up Maxine Waters in the book, right? One of the benefits of there being an uprising in her district was for her to be able to say, look, I've been telling you for a really long time that there are lots of people who need very basic things and you're not giving to them. And that's the reason for these protests. Let's actually like get this legislation passed. So one of the benefits of protests is to be able to visibly point to an audience and say that like, this is something, there are a lot of people more than you thought who are really concerned about something. And then there's also the use of protests as a kind of shaming mechanism, right? Like you haven't been paying attention to them and you should be, because this is your job and they're not going to stop until you actually respond. And so there are strategic parts of that. On the pandemic being a focusing event, and then the narrative about protests and police brutality. I don't think that the protests have changed the narrative about police brutality. There are a lot of people who believe that Black Lives Matter and that the 2020 Floyd protests were extremely dangerous, when I think there is data that shows that like 97% of the events were nonviolent. And when they talk about nonviolent, they also include property damage in that definition, right? And events that did become nonviolent, did become violent, including property destruction, were interactions with police officers using tear gas and all of these very aggravating things, right? It's gonna appear like violence. That people are gonna like, fall into a window if you're throwing rubber bullets at them, right? So sure, maybe that was violent. But then the narrative still among a lot of people is that those events were violent. And if they would have only protested in a better way, then maybe I would care about them. Similarly, on the January 6th, right? There are a lot of people who feel like it didn't happen, that it was like the FBI infiltrating, and or it was, you know, Antifa, and they were the ones who were actually the ones who were at January 6th, not the people who look like my cousin, right? It wasn't actually my cousin, someone, I don't know, right? The narrative is changing for people who want to care, but or actually open to listening and learning, but for people who are kind of dug in and just back to this narrative of only certain people are allowed to protest, only certain people are allowed to be American, I don't think that's changing.
Thank you. Peay, I see your hand. Go ahead.
You're muted.
You're still muted.
Okay. I have a couple of comments, and I think I want to start off by going back to the January 6th comments. I think the theory is still sound in that instance, because for people that protested and stormed the Capitol, the costs were low for them because they knew that they weren't going to be repressed by the government. They knew that the outcome that they wanted to overturn the election wasn't going to happen. So like, had they done it, the chances, like the cost calculations would have changed. The calculus would have changed, right? And on the other hand, people like Pence and the establishment Republicans didn't respond to them because they knew that the protesters' costs were low on their end as well. So the responsiveness didn't need to come there. Now, where it did change was at the state level. When we talk about the state changes, is like you're seeing them being responsive to the January 6th demands because the costs are different at the state level, right? Where you know 100 to 200 votes can take you out of power in many of these state congressional districts. So in places like Georgia, you're seeing this wave of new suppressive voter laws in Arizona and Georgia and Texas and all these other places that are directly attributable to the January 6th campaign. But the second thing, in a response to, you made a comparison between with Cori Bush, right? And like, shameless plug, me and Naj are doing work about like women of color lawmakers that don't see the rewards of being like the traditional institutional powerhouses that a lot of lawmakers grew to become over time, because that's not necessarily what gets things done or gets them reelected. A lot of times they can take it to Twitter and be just as impactful in the social sphere and in organizing and things like that outside of what's happening in the legislative body. So I'm wondering if like how the calculus might be slightly different with younger lawmakers who don't see traditional avenues of power as important to their legislative processes and their ascension to power, where they can get a lot of power in a relatively short period of time, and responsiveness looks different for them as well. So I'm just thinking through a lot of things, but like when you brought up that Cori Bush example, I'm like, well, she's not looking at it like Maxine Waters was a while back. I don't think that they're looking at it the same way anymore, you know? So yeah, I think I'll just throw that out there.
LaGina, quickly, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, on the first point of like all of these voting rights things being, I mean, these challenges of voting rights being about implications of January 6th, I'm not sure that that's the case, right? Like voter ID laws, like all of these things, the challenges have existed for a while. And I think Republicans have been looking at these demographic shifts for a while, and it may be easier to get some of this passed now, public opinion wise, but I think a lot of this may have happened even if January 6th didn't, because just, you know, the population looks different. The population's not as conservative as it used to be, or isn't as Republican as it used to be. So I don't know that it's an implication of January 6th. It definitely maybe was mediated by it, but I'm not sure there. And I have to think more about your comment about like these new legislators and their calculus of the re-election, right? I think Cori Bush, the squad, right? They value this social media audience, this ability to communicate in those ways, but they still have to win elections, right? And so they're still paying attention to who their voting bloc is and what they care about. And some of them don't care, right? They're here, they kind of feel like I'm here for a short time, but I'm trying to make a difference while I'm here. And so maybe that's a little different, just if that's like kind of the generational difference, and like I don't am not as concerned about staying in a job if it's not actually where I can make a big difference. But in terms of kind of like who their audience is, if they want to stay in office, like their audience is still their reelection constituency.
Can I jump in here? I just wanted to add to that.
Quickly, because we're out of time.
Oh, we're out of time. But I just wanted to add to that, that the squad and these younger legislators actually have to start thinking about having majorities in Congress too. It's not just them. And I think that right now they're willing to take no prisoners, but it's costly. And like Nancy Pelosi said, you still only have one vote in this, right? In the House. You might have 50 million followers, but you got one vote. And so they need to have Democratic majorities in order to be influential. And that might come sooner. This has been marvelous. So thank you. And the chat is amazing. So I wish we had more time. An hour is not long enough. That's what I was saying.
Not at all. I want to thank the panelists, thank Dr. Peay, Block, and Sinclair-Chapman, and please join me in congratulating LaGina on the publication of her new book. I've dropped the link in the chat. Please pick it up and support. Thank you all, and please enjoy the rest of your conference.
This was a pleasure, y'all. It's great seeing everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yep, excellent. See you later. Bye-bye.